Hello and welcome to part two or segment two of Citizens Forum, being filmed on Tuesday, March the 12th in the Memorial Arena. Our guest in this segment is Paul Summerville. Paul was the Liberal candidate in the recent by-election in Victoria when Denise Savoy vacated her seat. Just a bit of his biography. Paul, I think I can say, was educated at some of the best universities in the world.
Some, yes.
Spent time working for some of the most prominent financial institutions in the world. Has appeared on television worldwide and has been published in some of the world's most major newspapers. Ran for the NDP in 2006. Recruited by Jack Layton in Ontario. You then moved to British Columbia and I first heard your name when you were running for the Liberal Party in this by-election, which was won by NDP Murray Rankin. And what struck me most about your campaign was your take on sewage treatment, which I think was a fairly big issue. So if you'd like to say a few words about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I actually moved here in 2004, so okay. Been a resident coming on 9 years. We moved from Tokyo. I was working for TD Bank running a derivatives business for them in Asia Pacific, but my wife and I decided that our son needed to finish high school in Canada. And we had lived in Toronto, and she said to me that she'd only live in Canada where it didn't snow, which I thought meant Vancouver, until I went on and found out that there's less rain in Victoria than there is in Toronto, never mind Vancouver. So we moved here. When I was asked to think about running for the Liberals in the by-election, I had a long conversation with David Anderson about the sewage treatment issue. But it was actually an editorial in the Times Colonist by Green Party provincial leader Jane Sturt, who made the case that what was being proposed wasn't based in science and was potentially fiscally irresponsible. So I did my homework through the summer, and then when Denise announced that she was stepping down, I thought, and my campaign manager Kit Spence thought, that putting the sewage treatment issue forward would let us not only talk about that issue, but also the way it spoke to what Liberals believe, which is that public policy should be rooted in science and needs to be fiscally responsible. And it seemed to us, and I think there's lots of evidence, that in fact the sewage treatment plant is not necessary. There are better technologies, particularly if we're prepared to wait a while. And what really concerned me as a taxpayer here in Victoria was the open-ended financing around the sewage treatment plant. So although the federal government and the provincial governments are writing a $500 million check, every penny of cost overrun has to be borne by the city. So this is one of the largest investments in the history of the city. And I think there's a strong case to be made that it's being driven more by image. And it actually made the campaign a lot of fun. I think the thing I remember the most is when Mr. Floaty came out of retirement and endorsed Murray Rankin, who's a great guy and a great candidate, and I'm sure will be a great MP. But it's one of those things when you read it, when you read, okay, this has legs. And then of course the Conservative candidate flipped in the middle of the campaign. He'd been for it because the Conservative government in Ottawa had written this check. But of course what he was finding was that his base was strongly opposed to it because of the fiscal issues around it and the fact that it was more based on image than on science. And even Don Galloway, who's again a great candidate, was kind of caught offside because David Suzuki, although he was supporting Don, refused to endorse him because Don, like me, was not convinced by the science.
And Don was the Green
candidate who finished second and did a great job. So by the end of the campaign, the sewage issue really defined a lot of how the voters were thinking. They ultimately chose Murray Rankin, so I guess the sewage treatment plant is done. Although maybe more in sorrow than in anger, 2 or 3 years from now, when Dallas Road is being ripped up and cost overruns start to present themselves, people may take a different view. But it made the campaign very interesting. And again, for Mr. Floaty to come out of retirement and endorse Murray Rankin was just like the most perfect thing imaginable.
So I'm sure you did at least a bit of door-to-door. And what did people think about the sewage treatment issue?
Well, we knocked on about, I guess about 5,000 doors in the case of the campaign. I can't remember the numbers now. And I guess we spoke to 1,000, 2,000 people. And there was a very small group and very passionate who believed strongly that the sewage treatment plant had to be done, that it was a black eye for Victoria. Some of them were conversant with the science, others weren't. And those were people that you didn't spend a whole lot of time talking on the doorstep. What the narrative that emerged as we talked was the potential impact on taxes for homeowners. And I believe very strongly that we need to tax and regulate the economy in a way that we invest intelligently in infrastructure. I wrote actually an ed-op piece in the Times Colonist just before the referendum on the Johnson Street Bridge. I feel very strongly that we needed to have that bridge. And of course there was, many people had a different view.
Including myself.
But when it came to sewage, I think people felt that because there wasn't clear scientific evidence that this made any sense, the risk is that this was going to push up their taxes anywhere from $200 to $400 a year, and that's a very conservative estimate. But what also became clear is it was also going to hit small businesses. And so it went from a conversation about a value statement over science to it being kind of shoved down the throat of Victoria taxpayers, and then, wow, we're going to be, on the hook. Why do we have to do this? So it had a real life for itself, and it made for a very lively conversation on the doorstep. I was told by Steve Andrew at CFAX that I was a one-issue candidate, and I said, I was a one-issue candidate. I believe very strongly in protecting the public purse, and that any public investment needed to be rooted in science. What we did find as the campaign went along is that's what people wanted to talk about. We also were able to talk about other issues as well, issues dear to my heart, like legalization of cannabis, a guaranteed annual income, zero corporate income tax. These were things that we were able to get on the radar screen because we had the platform to talk about sewage.
So you believe in legalization of cannabis?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it for a second.
Okay.
Like, why? So, and I actually don't like to use the word believe. I like the word, I know, based on science, that legalization, regulation, commercialization, and taxation of cannabis is smart public policy. And it's smart public policy because it's safe. It's safe because people who want to smoke pot don't have to buy stuff on street corners, and they know what they're buying. So it's just like going to buy a pharmaceutical product or tobacco. You're buying it in a regulated environment instead of something that is made by somebody on their kitchen table and you don't know what's in it. There's a lot of evidence medically that it with moderate use, there's no addiction issues and there's no bigger health issues. But the other thing is that instead of putting people in jail and instead of frightening people, by commercializing marijuana, you can tax it. We raise Canada about $7 to $8 billion a year from tobacco taxation. And it's estimated that marijuana would be about $5 to $6 billion. In BC alone, it would be about $1.5 to $2 billion. As I like to say to students, that would mean that we could send every post-secondary student to school for free.
And all they have to do is smoke more dope.
Or you.
And me, yeah.
I mean, one of the things I found extraordinary was on Friday afternoons when I was knocking on doors. I would say good 5 to 10% of the doors that opened, there was a certain odor that came out that told me that something was being consumed. So legalization of marijuana is good public policy. And
plus, I'll just add one more thing to it, which is it takes money away from the drug gangs and the underworld.
Well, instead of funding criminals, you fund the education system, you fund the healthcare system. So it's a slam dunk. It's like a carbon tax. If you want to change the structure of the economy and you want to reduce fossil fuels, and you want to encourage the creation of green technologies, then you want to tax carbon. Again, it's good public policy. So if you go back to the conversation about sewage, we felt very strongly that the position we were taking on the sewage treatment plant was good public policy. And I think that's what resonated with people, and that's what made the campaign, by-elections sometimes aren't that interesting because they're not framed by that national narrative, but I think we had a lot of fun because we were able to talk not only about an issue that has a lot of metaphors that the media could have fun with, and Mr. Floaty coming out of retirement, but it also let us talk about what is good public policy. How do you design policy that's intelligent and is ultimately good for the community and for the individual.
Then you mentioned, I think, a guaranteed annual income?
Well, that's right. Guaranteed annual income was actually proposed by Milton Friedman, who's one of the most right-wing conservative economists and had a huge impact on things like deregulating financial markets and markets in total. And he made the simple point that you can do it two ways. Either you can say to people, hopefully your kids will take care of you when you get old because the state's not going to. Hong Kong is a very good example. When I lived in Asia, and you would walk by destitute old people because there was just no welfare support. You can do it that way. I think most Canadians, including myself, would be uncomfortable with that strategy. Then the other is to provide income support for people. So you can either create a big bureaucracy, like we have in Canada now, that clicks off a bunch of boxes to determine whether someone should get income support or not, or just use the tax system. And for the sake of argument, if you only made $10,000 one year, and for whatever reasons the annual income was $15,000, then you get a $5,000 tax rebate. You get everyone in the tax system.
You mean a $5,000
$5,000 check, that's right. And that's a really efficient way to distribute income, rather than doing it through a big bureaucracy. There's actually interesting support on both sides of the political spectrum for this. And again, this goes back to the question of effective public policy. What makes sense? Efficient delivery.
So of those two things, are they now federal Liberal Party policy, legalization of marijuana and guaranteed annual income?
Legalization, regulation, and commercialization and taxation of marijuana is official Liberal policy. It was voted on a policy convention that I participated in January 2012 in Ottawa. It was actually, the resolution was written here in BC by the BC Young Liberals. Then it went to the BC Federal Liberal Convention in November 2011. And then it went to the National Convention in January 2012, where it had overwhelming support. About 70% of Liberal members voted for that. So certainly I expect to see that in the platform in the election in 2015. Guaranteed annual income isn't in yet. It's very controversial. One of the things about a guaranteed annual income, just from a public policy perspective, Canada spends $120 billion a year in welfare supports, $120 billion. Yet our poverty outcomes have worsened over the last decade and not got better. So there's a conversation not only occurring in the Liberal Party, but in other parties as well, about a guaranteed annual income. But the legalization is official Liberal policy.
Let's move on to the ongoing federal Liberal leadership campaign that's taking place right now. You said you support Joyce Murray.
Yes. One
of, I think, 8 or 9 candidates?
There were 9. I think there's 8 now. One has dropped out.
And well, why don't you explain what her main, or one of her main positions is that at least is different from everyone else's, and the importance of it?
Well, first of all, just to step back, my support for Joyce is not just rooted in one policy difference, which is her call for cooperation in order to get rid of Stephen Harper and the Conservatives.
Maybe you can just explain what that means.
In 2015?
A lot of people don't know.
Yeah, I will. But just start off by saying that, Joyce built a large business, so she understands the importance of the economy. She was a provincial Liberal cabinet minister. in the environment, so she understands how politics works. She's I think a two-time winner in her seat in Vancouver. So this is an experienced business person and politician, very polished, very thoughtful. Among other things, including legalization of cannabis, she staked out a position all on her own on cooperation. And cooperation does not mean merger. What cooperation means is that there's a subset of ridings in Canada, about 55 ridings, where the progressive parties divide the vote to such an extent that the Conservatives win with about 35 or 36% of the total vote. What she is saying is that if she becomes leader, she will give the local riding associations, she won't mandate this, but she will give the local riding associations the opportunity to work with the riding associations for the Greens and the NDP to have a nomination where only one candidate is picked from the three parties. So there would be an open nomination process in order to run a progressive candidate against the Conservative. So for example, in the case of Calgary Centre, had the Greens and the NDP and the Liberals run, we would have a progressive candidate now representing Calgary Centre instead of the very right-wing Conservative politician who won. So her point is that Stephen Harper is doing generational damage to Canada in terms of a number of things they're doing around the economy, around social justice, around the environment, and it makes enormous sense for the progressive parties to find a way to cooperate. And so she staked out the position much like Nathan Cullen did in his leadership run. And you know, I think he finished a very strong second or third. I think there's a very good chance that Joyce can surprise a lot of people with the support that she's going to garner.
I hope she does. Paul, I'm afraid we only have 1 minute left.
Yes.
Why don't you say a few words about the economy from your point of view?
Well, I think we're in a recession here in British Columbia right now. We have the worst property market in 30 years here in Victoria. And there are signs that it's bad in Vancouver. So I would just encourage you know, your listeners to think very carefully about what their spending plans are, because the risk is, even though there are signs that the U.S. economy is recovering a little bit, I think BC is very vulnerable to a sharp downturn in the property market over the coming months.
Paul Summerville, thank you very much. This has been the second segment of Citizens Forum. Thanks for watching.